Hello everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at job design from the perspective of operations management. So if you've already looked at this through the lens of HR, you would have gone into far more depth and detail, but for operations management, what we're particularly interested in is a wide range of issues which really have a direct impact on the operation as a whole. So as well as things like process design and layout design, we also have to take into account individual job design to make sure that it is aligned with our operations performance objectives and other criteria. So we do need to understand the relationship between both individual job design and how that fits into the group job design as well. So how the group functions overall, whether it's a division, a department or a team, and as well as the individual jobs that comprise that particular group. The first thing to really note is job design really does feed into several other categories. So the most important of which really from an ops perspective is how that contributes towards the overall operations performance objectives. So we have our traditional 5 performance objectives: quality, speed, dependability, flexibility and cost. And our job design, both at an individual level and a group level, should be directly contributing or at least not contradicting or preventing the achievement of our specific performance objectives. Remember that these performance objectives are designed to highlight and optimize the operation. So what we can't do is aim to achieve all 5. That would result in none of them being optimized for. So choosing one or a few that are complementary and then optimizing the operation for that should be a clear benchmark for us to look at the individual job design as well as a group job design and make sure that it is aligned. Now that sounds all well and good but very vague, but you can think about a million different ways how this would play out in practical operational terms. So if your performance objective is let's say quality, then making sure the job design, if you're adopting something like TQM, total quality management, then an appreciation understanding of quality is necessary for all employees at all levels of the organization. But it also should result in individual quality activities and quality responsibilities amongst all employees depending on their role in the operation. What you can't do is have an operation that's trying to optimize for quality, but having specific quality officers being responsible for quality activities, quality assurance and quality control activities, whereas not having any mention of quality or having no quality activities assigned to other people within the team or the operation. So quality needs to be part of every individual job description and part of the design of every job. So we can see many ways how those performance objectives need to be reflected in actual job design in order for those performance objectives to be practical and real rather than just existing on a strategy document or being discussed in senior leadership meetings. They also have to be reflected in the actual work carried out in the organization and in the operation. And the best way to ensure that particular activities are carried out is actually design them into the jobs and into the groups themselves. The other 2 things that we need to pay particular attention to when designing jobs is health and safety and quality of working life. So it's a responsibility of all organizations to make sure they actually adhere to any health and safety regulations or laws that may apply. So in the UK there is currently a fairly comprehensive health and safety framework, although we'll see what happens in the aftermath of Brexit. And that is something which is a legal obligation, so it has to be taken into consideration. But also the quality of working life will be a really important determinant of how motivated, happy and ultimately productive the operations staff are. So any kind of attempt at designing an efficient operation has to really take that into account as well. Right. So job design is a very broad topic. It touches on tons and tons of different individual areas, and it is out of necessity because we're talking about a fairly specific low-level operational area, um, really massively determined by the actual operation, team, division, group, and ultimately role that we're talking about. So is going to differ hugely in terms of the practical elements of job design. So what we're going to do instead is just take a look at some of the major issues or things to consider when designing individual and group jobs. We'll start with an area which may be familiar to some of you depending on the units you've taken on the past, but that would be scientific management. Now, scientific is in quotation marks here because it's not particularly scientific, although it does make heavy use of things like time and motion studies, which are ultimately forms of observation research. But it is heavily critiqued, particularly over the last 30 or 40 years, because some of its foundational assumptions can be questionable. Now, scientific management as a whole may be really summed up as an attempt to understand what the best way to achieve a particular task is, which can be found, according to proponents of scientific management, through observation and specific research into that particular activity or job. Once you've identified what the most efficient or effective manner of doing a particular job is, then that can be designed into the job itself to ensure maximum output, maximum efficiency, and minimum waste. Now, that itself is highly questionable because it doesn't really take into account things like motivation, psychology, and behavioral approaches in general, which have become quite heavily researched and a certain type of counterweight to scientific management, but there are associated concepts which are far more diffused and therefore are worth looking into in more detail. And those would be allocated work timings as well as divisions of labor. The idea that we can take an individual activity or task, break it down into component parts, divide the labor required to achieve that activity amongst different specialized individuals, and therefore achieve maximum efficiency in that manner. Now, it does have significant major advantages. Quick learning, because you have a narrow range of tasks to actually do. You're able to really have this as a template for automation because we've broken down the activity into its constituent parts and we can see what can be automated and what can't be automated. And if you take this approach, you're going to really minimize non-productive work, depending on your definition of what productive work actually is. But the drawbacks are relatively obvious as well. Having very narrow tasks which are broken down into very small constituent parts is a pathway to physical injury because you're repeating the same task over and over again. And that can also lead to monotony, boredom, and therefore a lack of motivation. So if you take a task and you break it down into 7 different physical motions and you assign one of those to an individual worker, so you have 7 individual workers all repeating the same physical motion again and again, as well as the physical risk that poses, you also have a motivation risk as well. And it does really reduce flexibility because now we're piling the responsibility to make sure this activity is appropriate for all of the different circumstances that may occur upon either a supervisor, a manager, or on the job design itself and the process design itself. So that's not a particularly flexible way to approach a task or an activity, which may really have a range of adaptations that should be implemented depending on different circumstances. But because we've really divided the physical motions or whatever activities are needed, and we've try to minimize anything outside of our understanding of what's needed. The individual workers engaged in that job or that activity are not likely to either have the motivation or even the autonomy and freedom needed to make those adaptations on the fly. So those are major challenges. So that's really worth noting, that adaptation in individual tasks, activities, and jobs is often overlooked when we're sitting down to design them. We have an imagined scenario in our heads, which may be the most common circumstances that job is going to be done in, but it may not be the exclusive only circumstance. And if our job is designed and broken down in this manner, we're reducing the ability to actually have those adaptations occur, to minimize disruptions, and to be able to be flexible enough to adapt to keep the throughput going or keep the activity going, and to avoid any kind of breakages, stoppages, or other undesirable outcomes. So as well as that general area, which is one that is absolutely one to be looked at in more detail, we also have ergonomics and designing the working environment itself. So this is not so much about the design of the activities involved, but rather the design of the physical environment in which those activities are going to be carried out. Ergonomics is quite a common term. You may have heard it in lots of different circumstances, but really what it boils down to is understanding how people interact with physical elements or physical things, and trying to design both the individual things or the equipment, as well as the overall environment, in such a way that you have a minimum of inefficiency and stress, and instead you have a natural range of motion, and therefore it tends to have health benefits as well as mood benefits, motivation benefits, and productivity benefits. So we're talking about the interaction with physical elements as well as the overall arrangement within the working area. So we have some general idea of what kinds of physical attributes are needed, and we can do this by designing for the majority of use cases. Now, whenever we're talking about interaction with physical elements, we have to remember that people are different shapes and sizes, so we need to identify the majority of use cases when it comes to the actual individuals using the equipment or working in that particular space. Once we do so, we can have an understanding of what an optimal arrangement actually is. So we can see an example here of work area and placing needed tools and materials and resources within the normal work area to minimize stretching, reaching, and other unnatural motions which may be quite damaging in the long run or inefficient in the long run. As well as this, we also have a kind of broader consideration. So this is an example of ergonomic design within an office space, within office working. So having the equipment at a particular level or within easy reach, so to minimize kind of having forearms at the example at the top, higher or lower, which will cause long-term strain, making sure there's suitable lumbar support in the chairs, as well as having adjustable seat height for people of different lengths. Height is what I'm thinking of instead of lengths. And as well as this, we have other things. So the physical arrangement in terms of foot support, leg clearance, and trying to encourage a posture which is going to be sustainable, improve productivity, improve comfort, improve motivation, and ultimately be a benefit. So that is also an increasing trend within this area, for a number of those reasons. It isn't purely just about productivity, it isn't purely just about health and safety, it isn't purely just about mood and motivation, but rather a combination of all of the above. And lastly, I think it's worth just highlighting flexible working as a really increasing trend in this area that needs to be taken notice of, particularly during and in the aftermath of the number of different COVID-19 coronavirus lockdowns. We've seen a mass shift to remote working from home, and this has resulted in a recognition that a lot of aspects of jobs, current existing jobs, don't necessarily need to take place within a particular workplace or an office building or a particular site, but rather can be done remotely. There will be reading available on the Brio show for this. I think this is an emergent trend that's really been accelerated over the last 9 or 10 months, and is absolutely something that's worth looking into in more detail.